Is this a
Very
class?
well. Welcome, everyone, to the qualifying exam presentation of one of our first PhD students, Nancirose Piazza. Before introducing Nancy, I want to announce a few rules about the format of this presentation. First of all, it's open to general audience, and I really appreciate the interest. Thank you so much for coming to this presentation. The first 45 minutes of this examination session is going to be dedicated to Nancy herself. She'll be presenting her work, and we would prefer to keep questions to a minimum. If there is a minor detail that is not immediately clear to you, feel free to raise your hand and ask. But if you have a more detailed question, a question that requires a more detailed response, please hold it until the first Q&A session, which is going to be at the end of Nancy's presentation, where we'll dedicate 15 minutes to questions from the general audience. After those 15 minutes, we'll enter a closed session with the committee and Nancy herself. The committee will be asking further questions about Nancy's work for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll ask Nancy to leave, and the committee will deliberate and make a decision on, make a recommendation on your progression towards candidacy, Nancy. So without further ado, let me introduce Nancirose. She, as I mentioned, is one of our first PhD students. She's in the Security for Intelligent Learning Lab, working on reinforcement learning, cybersecurity issues in reinforcement learning, and multi-agent systems. The work she'll be presenting today was a collaborative work between the SAILab, the Royal Bank of Canada, and colleagues in different universities, including the University of Lisbon. However, the papers that Nancy is presenting today were all mainly authored by her. She's a lead author on both of the papers she's presenting. With that, I would like to leave the podium to you, Nancy. Please welcome Nancy for her presentation.
Hi everyone. Yeah, he just basically gave the intro for me, so I don't think I have to speak much right for that. I'm Nancy. I'm going to be giving a presentation on two of the papers that I have published. The first paper we'll be talking about is adversarial attacks on deep algorithmic trading policies. So let's start. The outline of this presentation is as follows. We'll be talking about reinforcement learning, then deep reinforcement learning, the terminologies, the DRL attacks and the adversarial objectives, the threat modeling that we'll be using for trading agents, active test time attacks and threat modeling for trading DRL, passive test time attacks. We'll be talking about DRL defenses, existing defenses, and then which is the second paper that we published, which is on a DBA strategy called constraint randomization of policy. We'll have some final remarks and conclusions, and that'll be the presentation. So what is reinforcement learning? Reinforcement learning is where we have agents where they interact with an environment through experience, trial and error, and numerical reward. We've seen reinforcement learning in games, such as, let's say, there is the ability to, we have seen agents where we can train them to play, let's say, chess or Go. But probably the more relevant ones that we come across nowadays is the usage of these agents in our daily lives, such as automated cars, and even like robot companionship. So if you know about Japan, their birth rate has been declining and their elderly population age has been increasing. So what this means is that with less younger people to look after older people, right, they need some sort of automated services to help these elderly people continue with their lives. So in a nutshell, right, the reinforcement learning framework is built off something called the Markov decision process. It's this discrete time stochastic decision-making framework. This is just a simple model of the agent taking actions which interact with the environment, and then they have the next state and the reward. The goal of using reinforcement learning, right, is to find a policy which is optimal that maximizes the expected total sum of discounted rewards. So this is basically objective. So traders, right, they want to maximize the amount of money they get for a particular stock. Unfortunately, the traditional reinforcement learning uses a table for lookup for states. This is obviously not going to scale. So we leverage something from deep learning, which is the deep neural network architecture. And this is what we call deep reinforcement learning. So what is the algorithmic trading? So algorithmic trading is where we have high frequency trading, where there is automation of large volumes and fast intervals of trading. Easier said than done, right? Algorithmic trading is actually accounted for around 60 to 73% of overall United States trading equity accounts according to the Modern Intelligence. And the algorithmic trading market is expected to increase in the CAGR. So this is kind of like whether this score here, which is 11.23, is basically going to tell you if something is a good investment or not. So the higher it is, basically between 15 and 20%, it means it's a really good investment. So it's relatively positive. And the growth is to be expected in North America as well as these other countries that you see before. So this means that this is completely relevant to where we live right now. And this is important to the businesses that exist here in the United States. Oh, how do I do that?
What is up, you sexy YouTube?
Okay. See also? No. I don't know how to switch that with you. I don't see the option here to switch it out of this view.
So what we're talking about?
I want to share screen view and want to once again, I'm sorry for the interruption.
Okay. So why necessarily do we want to use deep reinforcement learning for trading? Well, reinforcement learning, as the way it sounds, right? If we can have an agent that can consider future actions, which is basically, right, basically the way humans do decision making in a way, right? That's basically trading. We want to know, we want to predict future stocks. So if we can leverage the current estimation and previous past estimation of historical events, well, some way, right, we want to predict what's going to happen in the future. So yes, obviously. But unfortunately, like I said before, traditional reinforcement learning, table lookup is not that efficient. So instead, we will look to deep learning to leverage their neural network architecture so that we can expand to higher dimensional learning. So deep reinforcement learning has been shown to be useful in financial applications. That's a survey from 2020. It's completely relevant, right? But the question is, well, deep learning might work for trading, for financial applications. Do deep reinforcement learning agents work? Like, do their performance, are they beneficial enough for people to use them? And the answer is obviously yes. There are plenty of papers on surveys that exist that they want to leverage reinforcement learning or deep reinforcement learning in trading, right? So that's quite useful. However, using these tools, right, there's actually a big problem with deep architecture, which you will know in the next slide. And that is the fact that deep architectures are susceptible to something called adversarial examples. Adversarial examples, right, despite of how we track them, they're just basically this input with some perturbations, which will produce some very unexpected output. So in this example, as you see visually, we have a picture of a panda. By adding some noise, which is not detectable to a human, we can actually change the output of the model and its confidence. And this is problematic, obviously. So when we have adversarial examples, how do we really, how do we actually determine what to do with them, and how do we minimize the damage that occur with this, right? So what we do is we threat model it. We threat model the adversary's intention, and we threat model the agent itself. So adversarial intentions follow something that we in computer science consider as the CIA. confidentiality, integrity, and availability. If we apply this to the model itself, we can consider the confidentiality of the model. This is like the intellectual property, the privacy of the training or the testing data, as well as the integrity of predictions and the availability of the model for the system that is hosting the model. So of course, right, if the model is being, let's say DDoS, where it's out of commission and it can't actually be used, right, that means these traders who are implementing them are losing value of their stock. So before we get actually into trading DRL attacks, right, the general conception of DRL attacks is that it is an attack on some part or component of the MDP. And this might be the observation space, the reward function, the transition dynamics, or the action space. Now, all attacks are in deep learning models will apply, right? But the extension to reinforcement learning is that the dimension of time is a big complexity, which can cause serious problems to these agents when they take sequential actions. So this is another list of some existing attacks that exist for DRL mostly, which are just shown here to show you that timing of these attacks can be relevant to the purpose of their objective. And this could be critical to infrastructures where timing is actually is more imperative sometimes than even than other things. There are basically two kind of attacks. These are the strategic attacks that they consider the timing of when to find and when to attack. And then there's something here, which is called the reward poisoning attack. So this is a poisoning attack where in training phase, we decided to take a percentage of the training data and modify it in such a way that this model will learn a representation which is non-intended, which can be used for malicious purposes. So this is our DRL trading agent threat model. This basically just shows you the attack surface of the agent, the channels which are available to an adversary, as well as the attacks that you can perform on a particular channel. So here's the agent, here's the bank, which is the reward channel. It's attached to the actual channel is with the actual execution of the action, and then in between is the observation state channel, which is basically what the agent sees. So this is where we're going to perform our certain types of active attacks. So adversarial attacks are inevitable, but using a threat model, we can outline the parts of this model which can be attacked and minimize the damages that can be done. The attacks that we'll be showing are going to be test time attacks, but they're not exclusively test time. The reward channel and actual channel, we don't really discuss too many attacks on them at the moment, but they can definitely be attacked. The input channels can be attacked individually, but we're going to be attacking the observation channel. So yes, this trading model is also based off an existing framework from a previous thesis paper from Vezadon. And right, if we measure the adversary budget, the measurement of an adversary resource is accessible to perform an attack. I'm going to run through some terminologies that you should know so that you're not left in the dark when I start saying them. An attack can be classified as targeted or non-targeted. Targeted basically means that a very specific adversarial action can be taken. If an adversary can take a very specific action that's targeted, any non-targeted is basically any change of the action to any other action that's not the intended action from before. There are white box and black box attacks. White box attacks basically means that you have full access to the model. There's also areas in between, and black boxes when you don't necessarily know the components of the model itself, but you do have access to it, so you can query it. There are active and passive attacks. Active attacks change agent's trajectory, right? They're intrusive. And passive attacks will gather adversarial information on a target agent. And then there are test time and train time attacks. Test time is an attack on an agent that's on a fixed policy, and a training time attack is an attack on an agent during its training phase. You are basically manipulating the policy that it's learning. So this is basically what we'll be going through for our DRL trading agent architecture. We'll be talking about the observation space, what it sees, the reward function, what incentivizes the agent in numerical form, and then the action space. So what actions can the agent actually take? In the observation space, what does a trading agent use as the observation space? Well, in trading, right, there's something what we call time frequency intervals, and this is what we call a bar. A bar can be a measure of high price, low price, open price, and closed price. However, right, that's not the only thing that could be in the observation space. We could also include technical indicators, which are financial calculation on historical values, which are used for forecasting future market directions. So there's the moving average conversion divergence and the relative strength indicator, as well as more, but these are the ones we use for our agents. The information that is in the observation space can be public, or they can be private, or a mixture of both. So the reward function for these agents is completely comparative to the policy that it learns, right? So what is the reward function for trading agents? The basic reward function that people will use is like a profit or a loss, right? But unfortunately, using this kind of reward function doesn't have any risk awareness or expected loss, which most traders really use for their estimations on how well a stock works. So instead, right, you might decide to go with something more complicated and a little more human readable, right, which is financial metrics. There's the Sharpe ratio, which was used for one of our models, and then there's the Sorrentino ratio, which is an option for that model, but we didn't use that one. But both of them are highly interested for traders because of obviously it was implemented into the library. But yeah, and then that's just actually the expression of the Sharpe ratio if you wanted to know. The action space for these agents can be discrete. Discrete just means that that it's a Cartesian product of finite quantities. You can buy, wait, sell, or you can buy, wait, and sell in intervals. And this might be proportional to the stock, or it might be a literal value of a particular stock. It can also be continuous, so a real value between some sort of continuous range, 0 and 1, might be a percentage to buy stock, but this is all up to the designer. So in our investigation, we're going to look at two agents. One's called, we call it the basic DQ1 because it has relatively simple observation rewards actions, right? So this might not be a more practical one you would implement, but it proves a point of why this is important. And then there's the more practical one, which is from TensorTrade. It's a more complicated DQN agent. It has more values in the observation space. Its reward function is a particular financial metric, and the action space is much larger. It's like, for our basic agent, we had a size of 3. For our TensorTrade agent, it was a size of 181. That's a much larger space. And then there's the window size for each one. So how far back in history can they look at a previous stock price for their bars, as well as the termination condition. So for active test times attacks, we're going to look at the observation channel. So attacking the observation channel basically comes down to almost like an image processing type of attack, right? So there are 2 white box attacks that we will look at, which is called fast gradient sign method, FGSM, and Carly and Wagner, which is called CW. This is exactly just an FGSM, right? This is on an image process task. So this is why you can see why this works, right? But if I show you for trading agents, it's maybe not as visibly convincing until you look at the difference, right? For trading agents, we want to find a sample which is very close to the original, but just slightly off in terms of value, right? But the action that actually occurs when you show this agent, this perturb observation is going to be different. So we introduced to a type of attack on DRL trading agents is called observational delay. So depending on how you actually implement this kind of attack, it will determine the budget you use, right? But if you can, let's say, desynchronize the clocks of an agent, right, and you can show that a particular time step's observation, it gets shoved to a future time step at t+1, you can actually impact the performance of these agents on the total reward performance. And then we move towards non-targeted attacks. So the 2 attacks that we work on is FGSM and CW. Non-targeted attacks, as I said before, basically change any action to any other action but the one that was originally chosen. You can see that it actually has the success rate for non-target attacks can be slightly higher than, of course, targeted attacks, but they can still produce convincing examples, which, you know, if you show it to a person, they might not say, hey, that's an adversarial example necessarily. And then we have the failure rates. So this is the performance rates of those non-targeted attacks. You can see for both agents, for CW and FGSM, they both perform, they have a deterioration in performance. That's kind of to be expected, right? But it can be unexpected. But what's more important to the traders of these, right? They don't really care about the total return. They care about the actual network impact. So if we look at TensorTrade, which has the ability to track the network of an agent, right? We can see that the network of the agent is tied, you know, in some direct way with the total return. And this is negatively impacting the agent's ability to perform in the environment that it was already seeing, right? But it can also be unexpected because this is a non-targeted attack. Targeted attacks, which are a lot less successful, is where we change the action to a very particular adversarial action, which we know will hurt the agent's performance. So again, you can see just the failure rates of how they, that it's not necessarily as successful, right? But when it is successful, it actually hurts a lot for these agents. So here's some examples of what some samples look like. You don't have to worry too much about that. Some successful CW attacks as well. This is just some more technical stuff based on how we search for these parameters. The performance impact is that while they may not be successful a lot of the times, when they are successful, they impact the performance greatly. And likewise, the performance in the network of the tensor trade agent is greatly compromised. And you can actually see in none of them really, all of them are negatively impacted by target attacks. So moving away from active test time attacks, we have passive test time attacks. So passive test time attacks, you can think of them as an observer. A man-in-the-middle attack is a passive test time attack where an observer can observe the trajectory of a target policy. Now the question is, those observations, is that useful to an adversary? Well, my answer is yes, right? So here are some things that I would like to state about passive test time attacks, right? That might be useful to an adversary if they make a successful passive test time attack. So if the observation contains sensitive information, PID information, anything that's identifiable, or trader information, that's quite valuable. If there's experience that can be used to train another policy that is like the target policy, can lead to more white box attacks. We'll get into that. And if experiences can be used to train another policy that an adversary can directly use to make profit. So that all depends on the adversary's objective. So for the first one, right, we actually already see that language models can be compromised by leaking data from the data it was trained on. So technically this can be true for these agents too. You can also gain information on the target policy architecture for stronger attacks. And explicitly, if we can learn to imitate the policy, right, there's actually a branch of learning called imitation learning that addresses leveraging demonstrations. And instead of using it for good, right, we're going to be trying to think of the adversarial usages of imitation learning. So imitation learning is actually not that quite old, but the documentation is from 1991, so it is kind of old in terms of how old I am. Is the learning to imitate an expert policy through demonstrations, behavioral clones, which is dated back to 1990s from the earliest that's been documented on paper, are supervised learners that match demonstrations. If you include imitation learning and reinforcement learning objectives, you can learn a policy. Your objective is to learn a policy which is as good or outperforms the expert demonstrations. So for imitation learning, for our testing purposes in our demonstrations, we'll be looking at a particular variant called deep Q learning from demonstrations. This kind of method was developed in a way such that we wanted to minimize early stages of training. So what happens is with all policy agents is that they actually have they have destructive optimization initialization. So for a large part of the earlier training, they can get hurt. So if you have, let's say, an agent that's learning to pick up a bottle, it might take 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 times for it to break its arm to learn it's not a very good policy. So to avoid doing that, right, we try to show them good examples of what you should do to push them towards a policy that we would want. The basic idea is to train them on the expert policy demonstrations that we call the pre-training phase, and then train in the environment along with prioritizing the expert demonstrations. So here we have the imitated agents versus the target agents on performance. You can see that while they vary, you can still get some usefulness out of querying this target agent on basically its samples, right? So yeah, it is useful. You could use it for something. The question now it also comes up is that, well, the assumption for DQFD is that it's a continuous set of experiences. But unfortunately, if an attack fails at any particular point in time, you have a discontinuous set. Is it still useful to have these imperfect demonstrations? And also, right, is it useful to approximate or interpolate demonstrations in between if you're missing information? Well, yes, you can. You can't really expect it to be exactly like ways or like the target agent in some ways, but you can still get competitive agents out of it. The demonstrations are still quite useful. If that wasn't necessarily your intentions for, let's say, adversarial profit for using the model themselves, if the point of the objective is to attack the model at some point in time, then there's something called the transferability, where you can train a model that's supposed to be very like the target policy. You develop attacks which are based on that proxy model to build stronger white box attacks, and then you show those examples to the target policy. If that target policy becomes more vulnerable because of that proxy model, that's something we consider as transferability of an attack on an agent. And you can kind of see that, well, some of the agents don't do too well with transferability. Some of the pre-training phase agents actually expose a bit of the original target agent's architecture in a way that the attacks are more successful. So away from URL attacks, right? You have people who want to develop defenses against these attacks. Generally, defenses look to increase one of two things. They try to target one of two things. They try to increase an adversary's budget or minimize possible damages from an attack. They often fit underneath a category such as regularization, robust learning, adversarial detection, distillation, and data sanitization. More specifically, for defenses against deep reinforcement active attacks, if we break it down into the model that we had before with the components of the Markov decision process, we have the observation space, the reward function. These kind of fit where they would fit in terms of the defense. Watermarking, distillation, anomaly detection, adversarial training, they all kind of fit underneath observational space. And then the reward function, there are defenses against reward poisoning as well. Other overlapping areas of research might be a risk-averse, robust reinforcement learning, and robust learning. However, though there's a lot of defenses for active attacks, there's not that many for passive attacks. Mostly because the defenses that do exist for passive attacks, quote unquote, we consider passive attacks, it's mostly about censoring the training data itself, sanitizing the training data, or protecting for privacy reasons. But we really want to develop a defense which will focus on the policy execution. In other words, we want to, in some way, protect the state action transition. So let me give you a policy stealing problem and see if you guys would agree with me. You finish teaching at the university for a day and you get into your car. Halfway through your commute, you realize you're being followed. You want to get home quickly, but you don't want the observer to know your usual route. That's your optimal route. You assume that you learned this best route, right? This will happen every day for a month. Your only method of defense is the path you choose to execute every day. What do? Now, for me, I would deviate. So I would deviate from my usual path. I would take a detour. But the question is, how often do you deviate? How much do you deviate? How do you balance between deviating and your main objective? Well, that's kind of where our defense comes from. Constraint randomization of policy. Constraint randomization of policy call crop follows this deviating strategy. It is designed for value-based RL methods. So when we learn, a policy, there are basically two types of methods. There's value-based methods and there's policy-based methods. This is for value-based methods. We define using two values, but whatever value function you're using, right, you can choose that. Given some threshold of expected loss difference from the optimal, we can choose any candidate action. And then from those candidate actions, we'll take a uniform random selection on the candidate actions. So kind of like an greedy exploration policy, but the constraint is that we don't just take any action, we take actions that are constrained. Now, if you follow crop, a strategy might be to deviate frequently, but with a low threshold. So what that means is I'm going to deviate my path route from school to home by picking a slightly different route every day, but often. Or I can deviate rarely, but with a high threshold difference when I do deviate. So in other words, I could not deviate for most of my ride home, but as soon as I get within 2 blocks of my home, I decide to do circles around my house, right? I could do that. or I can adaptively deviate depending on the expected loss. So in this way, right, we're humans, we have feedback when we think about our past actions, and we kind of adjust our future actions based on what comes to fruition based on our past actions. So maybe by estimating how badly you did based on what your expected loss is, you can estimate a much more safer future policy deviation, maybe. So this is the more formal introduction of crop. Let A be an element of something we call the candidate actions, which satisfy this constraint, where it's less, the difference between the action you take and the optimal action is less than some threshold. Crop is defined as this: at a probability delta, you will take the optimal action, or if your candidate actions are empty. Otherwise, you will take at probability 1 minus delta an action from your candidate actions. So if we think about what crop's supposed to do, let's think about what happens when we don't have crop. Without crop, a policy, its target policy, will execute its most optimal trajectory, right? That's being true and being true in earnest. If the policy is deterministic, right, the adversary will know once it's visited, it will know the optimal state action pair for that state. If it's stochastic, right, they can empirically estimate the policy over observed pairs. But once I introduce crop, the intuition crop is that we introduce a suboptimal SA pairs within the optimal SA pairs during execution. And so the way this would impact imitation learning methods is that for behavior clones, which are supervised learners, right? If the adversary policy is deterministic, if I'm at a state S and then I take action A, I say that's the best one. And then suddenly it says, oh, I'm at the state same S, but I take action B and I say that's the best one. That's conflicting. So that means that the adversary is going to have to say, well, maybe it's not a deterministic policy, maybe it has to be stochastic. So it says, oh, it's stochastic. However, because it's stochastic in crop will change the distribution of the optimal learning distribution, because the actual observed policy that occurs right during execution is not the same as what it would have taken. Likewise, for inverse learning, if you decide to use inverse learning, that's underneath imitation learning, right? The fact that the assumption we assume the expert demonstrations are optimal is compromised. So now your adversary is learning a non-optimal function, basically a non-optimal function. Is that really worth it, depending on their adversarial objective? So what's more, so what now we have to do is think about crop as a mitigation. So crop as a defense or mitigation, it aims to minimize the adversary gain from expert demonstrations or increase adversary budget. So it goes to minimize the adversary gain from expert demonstrations because, right, if we decrease the number of observed optimal state action pairs, we're proportionally increasing the number of suboptimal action pairs, right? So we're hindering the adversary's capability to learn, unless, of course, if there are certain methods in imitation learning where they know the expert demonstrations are non-optimal at some point and they decay the importance, right? But that basically means they need an environment which will be better, but that's more expensive. So that increases their budget, so they're less likely to do that. You can see the paper more explicitly on expected budget, but the point is that to increase the adversary's budget, right? If we increase the adversary's imitation learning training budget, it will take longer for them to reach some performance than if they just were able to observe the optimal state action pairs during the execution of the agent. Invertly, right, this also increases the number of successful attacks needed because, right, if we keep hiding optimal state action pairs, we're going to need to keep sampling from the model more and more to probably get an optimal state action pair. On a side note, expected losses, kind of the way we would want it to minimize in the case that you're worried about the performance loss of this agent, it's kind of similar to regret. So regret actually is a terminology that's used in reinforcement learning as the difference between the most optimal policy taken if you knew the optimal policy from the day one versus up until now, right? But unfortunately, measuring loss is difficult because common Q value definition is discounted future estimations. But obviously, if we deviate, we're not taking that trajectory anymore. So That's hard to estimate. So for our implementations, we have 3 variants. We have the Q value based threshold, which is the definition from crop, how we define crop traditionally. Then we have the variant which is called advantage inspired threshold, and then positive advantage inspired threshold. Basically, what advantage inspired threshold and positive advantage inspired threshold try to do is they're like one step look behind. Because the definition of the Q value is expected future rewards, it has no constitution of previous action. So if we have one step look behind, in some ways we can minimize the loss between the previous state and the current state. So by having these restrictions, they kind of fit better with some, so if you have a human defender, right? They have a certain level of tolerance for performance deterioration. By having a more, having a metric which is measuring something that relates its past actions to its current actions, they may have a higher tolerance. So here are the empirical results on the Atari games, on 3 of them so far. You can kind of see that it generally takes more training for an imitated agent trained on crop demonstrations to reach a certain level of performance than if we had an imitated agent trained on optimal demonstrations. Also, these imitated agents generally perform worse than its target policy, so that kind of helps as well. What's also important to this crop defense is that you have to do something called the parameter search. You have to search for certain fine-tuning parameters which will match the game that you want depending on your tolerance of loss for the game. That makes sense, right? In the sense that, you know, some people have higher tolerance for loss or lower tolerance for loss, and certain games have different dynamics. It might be good to run a few games and find a good set of values. The remarks, for different games, there are different risks. And those values or those magnitudes of risk values, like in the risks, are different too. So the distribution matters. So that's why you have to search for good parameters. Finding one is subjective, right? And it all depends on how much tolerance a particular defender might want to, but it kind of fits underneath risk awareness, risk averse, and risk seeking behaviors. Choosing how far to look behind and how many previous actions should really matter to your current state also can help to minimize the amount of unexpected loss from crop. And there may be different behaviorals in empirical experiments when we use a different definition of Q values. So the Q value definition we use is expected future, expected future discounted rewards. However, there are also different definitions such as maximum average reward, as well as in some directions also look at hindsight too, but they may perform differently. So these metrics will have to be adjusted. So regardless, randomness can be used as a fundamental deviation strategy. We do this in game theory all the time. So it's really fine tuning and finding the set of values that work for this particular game that becomes a subjective art. In conclusion, we moved from our deep reinforcement trading agents which are susceptible to adversary attacks. We've shown a threat model of it, the components in this, the attack surface, which can be attacked by adversarial attacks. We talked about active attacks, passive attacks, demonstrated what they can look like for trading agents. And then we discussed existing areas of research that can be used for threat modeling for current and future research. We have presented the scope of existing defenses and attacks in DRL agents. It's still relatively new, in a few years, but it's still relatively new in comparison to a lot of the machine learning defenses and attacks that are out there. And we introduce our deviation strategy mitigation against adversarial policy imitation from passive attacks called constraint randomization of policy, and discuss its intentions and impracticalities. And these are the references. And that's it.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Nancy. Now, the next machine is allocated to questions from the general audience. First, let us begin from those who are in this room. Does anybody have any questions that would like to ask Nancy about the work?
Any constraints for the people that want to ask?
No,
PhD. No, anyone.
Anyone can. That's of course fine. Have a PhD
more used to the model where just PhD models can ask.
Oh,
PhD.
that's from me.
Hmm.
Now we are moving to questions from James on computer, including Nancy on for the online.
Yeah.
communication.
Nope.
I don't know whether they can hear me or not, but if is there anyone on Zoom who would like to ask questions?
Anyone on Zoom have a question?
All right, so I'm going to kick off the part of the general Q&A. Your thoughts or attack performance results. I term P equals 0.1, 0.5, 0.8, and 1. I assume that's some form of probability, but probability of what exactly?
So that
If
is,
you can,
oh,
please.
yes. It's easier to think of that, right? Unfortunately, if you add a lot of animations, it becomes longer to do that. Okay, so let's take this an example, right? That probability right there is the probability that the attack occurs. So if I have a probability of 1, that means every time step gets attacked. And if the probability is 0.01, right, that means at that probability, that is when we attack. That doesn't mean the attack's successful. It just means that's when we attack. So it could also we could have that probability, we perform the attack and it fails, right? So that is possible.
Why are you only considering these probabilities, 0.01, 0.5, 0.1, and 1? Why not 0.9 or 0.65?
So those are just my choices for parameter searching. Like it's supposed to give you an idea what kind of performance would occur at that particular probability. You could also do a more in-depth search by looking at it in intervals like a 0.05, right? But then it would get really messy. So that's only really there for you to get an idea that even with low probability of an attack actually occurring, we can still get a deteriorating performance. I just don't have to show you exactly 0.05 versus 0.01.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
So if I can piggyback on that question before, right? So if you look especially at the picture at the bottom left, but there's no modifier for the decreasing or increasing performance there. Like that 0.01, sorry, that 0.1 line needs to perform better than the 1.0.
So here's the funny thing. The attacks are derived on determining which action would do the most harm to this agent based on by showing the observation and showing which action has the least value. However, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that that trajectory along the line is going to be the worst. It's a little unexpected. You can't really predict exactly how certain actions will occur in futures until it occurs. So sometimes you might see this where it spikes up and then spikes down. This could have spiked all the way up, right? But the point is that attacking impacts and basically impacts its total return. But when you have targeted attacks, right, they're more likely to hurt the agent in that sense that it obviously lost value versus that maybe if someone decided to take it up just turn here. Like a little bit of adversarial information causes a deterioration in the direction of how to hurt the agent rather than knowing how much really to hurt the agent.
Is that the same about the top and bottom? Like, you're showing us, like, you're just showing a very small snippet of the top left-hand picture and the bottom left-hand picture, the time scale.
Oh, these times up? Okay.
Yeah.
So this one's for the basic.
So you're just showing that first little bit.
Okay, so the data set that we just tested it on was basically 30,000 observations long time system. That's why you consider that. So you saw the whole entire trajectory throughout the entire duration of the data set. Or we just did 25 because this is actually a real time scale. You can go on for 1,000, 10,000, right? But the more longer I get here, the less you can see here.
one's a little bit from when I did these was in Hawaii, so 2020.
There's two different data sets. How come you have two different kind of metrics to look, right? So one data set you're using this total return difference method. The other one you're using is total return, right? Am I reading that incorrectly?
Right. The reason I use difference is because if I didn't use difference, visually you would not be able to see the difference.
But how do you compare the two models then if you have two different metrics?
The part of this part. This difference. This was completely off the wall, but I have to be a straight line.
Yeah, sure.
So you can kind of see by it definitely, however, visually for vision purposes, when I show you the flower, I take the difference because if it wasn't like that, it kind of look like this, but the scale on the left would be incredibly large. So it would be very hard for you to see the difference rather than give you a smaller range of values to show you, but easier to see.
Nancy, what's the point of these plots? What are you trying to demonstrate with these plots, and why are you doing this for two different models?
So to answer why I'm interpreting these plots is that I'm not showing the deterioration of the performance of the agent, and there's some forms that just can never be made up based on the time that we happening with this, right? And if you think about it in the lifetime, there's no real way to really predict whether or not a particular action can be made up later on in the future. But obviously, if someone's intervening with your agent and they need harm, there's a good chance that the performance will deteriorate because of it. Choices of is that this is an theoretical showing you that yes, you can impact it and it can look like that. This is the typical basic simple agent. The more important agent is in reality, these attacks work in reality. Do they actually come to fruition? Do they impact the network of these agents? And does it actually, these attacks actually, chart? Yes, in that sense, right? This is why I think this particular this graph, because the agents themselves, well, if we could see into the future, that'd be great. And we can't really, just by knowing the fact that these attacks can be successful, even at a small percentage, but when they are successful, they are incredibly deteriorating their performance. I think that's enough to reason for it.
So how are you judging what is incredibly deteriorating performance? Like, do you have a number of those TRD numbers at the type, the scale on that thing? Again, and I don't know, can you explain a little more about that metric? What that total return difference actually is, and how it compares to total return before?
Sure. So this total return, so this model here uses the Sharpe ratio, the Sharpe ratio polarization as its reward function. So this return is basically this one. The total return is based on total loss or total profit, profit or loss for a particular cost. Obviously, the difference in the shifts of how you see the scalings of the reward function along the axis. In terms of how that depends on what model. If this attack did a very minimal damage, it's like $200, maybe that don't fit. And that's just like maybe $200. That's okay. But think about a company that owns a bunch of these, and that's $100. It starts to compound among each other. So that depends really how far do you want to and things, the resource build that is worth the compensation over the performance distribution. It's always like noise is way to distribution and performance too. So there's also that, but this is more intentional for us to.
So, the last at the bottom the plot. We showed three trees, but I think that they don't want.
Yes, they are.
Oh, really?
Yeah, unfortunately. Some of these plots, unfortunately, they literally are so close, even in difference, that they don't have much of a deviation. So in some ways, some attacks, like if I attack at this, they're about the same in terms of deterioration and performance. So maybe I don't even need to attack all the time. I could just attack some of the time.
So what is the
So the vertical axis, you mean this?
yeah, what is the
So there is the total return like that, and then there's the total difference. So there'd be the straight line. This means the optimal return that the agent would have taken if no attacks occurred. The difference in between is showing you that by attacking the agent, its performance gets deteriorated. So that's what this range is really for. If the line was going upwards, that means then obviously the agent is benefiting from the attacks, but that's not the case.
Sure. All
Okay, so the bottom one, the vertical axis means the difference.
vertical axis for different connectors. That the scales of these two plots are also different.
Yeah, it's going to explain like 1 to the e times to positive 7, but on upper the return is lower than 100. How could that be different?
Well, it really depends on what we see.
What would be the question? What would be the equation to compute this? PRP?
So the equation which was used to compute the difference is that we show the agent basically what the policy would take itself, like if there was no attacks, right? So it gives us some sort of baseline, and it gives us some cumulative return over each time step. We take that, and then each time step we'd say, well, if we attack it, do we subtract that particular value? Because obviously since they're value based, right? There's a value that's being associated here. And so because that's associated value on the return, we just take that difference as our way of measuring the total return difference. The more important scale for traders is, of course, is the network, but this is just showing you that the total reward differences are decreasing when these attacks are successful.
This is still kind of all the same question you're asking, like what are the units of that, right? So it's different. It's different from what? Different than dollars. We all understand that 0 is what is actually, and this is worse than 0 is bad, but a percentage or something would be way more useful.
Somewhat, it depends, right? Because the return is all based on the reward function. Because the profit and loss is used as a reward function for the first one, you can kind of get, well, this might be literally, if this is in dollars, then that would be in a dollar, right? But the reward function with the Sharpe ratio, its range of values is not necessarily equivalent to monetary value. It's like range of 0 to 100 or something like that. And when you take the difference of that, that's not really
So
clear.
these are differences in Sharpe ratios.
So because the reward function is Sharpe ratio, right? The total return would be the sum of discounted rewards, like the sum of Sharpe ratio is discounted.
How are we getting negative value? Sharpe ratio is positive.
Some sort of value.
Like the higher Sharpe values are better, right? So how would better value as your second point? You should never get a negative number. Okay.
Difference of something with itself is different.
Right, yeah.
That's
This is the optimal path with itself, so that's true.
Sure.
This is the difference of the optimal path from the time that actually got to right to first realize sales.
which one subtract the something.
The optimal path would be right, so it's here. So then in order to show you this, right, the expected performance of the agent would be so absolute price is expected to be lower. So you take that larger value minus the lower value, plus that would be the inverted difference.
complete the other way, and now it's just showing the deformity. I can literally flip this upside down to show you the other way. But the vision. I want to show you that. And TV is policy.
Coming to the end of the general Q&A, let me see if there's anyone else there would like to ask a question, or whether we would like to continue this discussion for a couple of minutes before moving into closed discussion with the committee. Eric, Mo, Cheryl, anyone else? Would you like to follow up on the same line of questioning, or does anybody have any other questions they would like to ask? So I'm going to close the general, a very generic question. Care about this. Why would they care about this? What do they care about this? And how would they be able to benefit from it?
So I primarily think that companies that work with trading algorithms would care about this the most. Individual traders might care a little bit, but to be attacked by an adversary for an individual trader is a little less likely than for a company to be attacked. Because if you large scale this, like for a company, right, they might distribute this across other, a large fleet of agents. And that's where real control and power comes into place. Like if an adversary has control over these agents in some way, right, they can basically shift the market if they have enough of them.
So that confirms hedge funds.
Big names, yeah, big
who
players.
Use reinforcement learning. I know that you know this from, well, let's say insider information. I see from RBC working with, but in the literature, and if you come across any citations, references to deep RL being or being adopted in the application. Know that there's a lot of theoretical articles that extend there. We have oral unofficial confirmation that it's being heavily used by at least one firm. Did the literature point to Excel or references on how RL itself is being used?
Yeah, one second, I get to the first. Yeah. So, while this is not screaming at me that they exactly use reinforcement learning, right? The fact that a large percentage of, say, if equity trading is automated, in like for traditional people, like if they're not big firms, they could be big firms, but if they sit somewhere here, right? I don't see the reason why they wouldn't try to use something like reinforcement learning for sequential decision making. That seems to me like more of a intuition, but in practice, right, under the hood, I only really know of basically the other, basically from the Royal Bank of Canada, right, they're on non-consensus is that they do use it. And if they use it, I assume other competitors use it. So.
And to wrap everything up, can we now go and hack the Wall Street?
No, I can't get confirmation for that, but if you do it, out of sight, out of mind, whatever happens.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy, for answering our questions. We are at the end of the open session. So please give a warm thanks to Nancy for a wonderful work. Now, if you're not in Nancy's qualifying exam committee, please leave the room. If you're on Zoom, unfortunately, we'll have to ask you to leave as well. The remainder of this session will be behind closed doors, but the results will be announced after the deliberation, not public, not the Thank you for being there. Do you want to stick around with us? I don't think I need to.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question too, though. That was hard.
Vivek, can we meet at the station? You know that. All right.
Thank you.
Great job. You did really well.